December 15th, 1944. Camp Como, Mississippi. Master Sergeant Robert McKenzie stood at 0630 hours outside the barbed wire fence of the female prisoner compound, morning fog rolling across the Delta flatlands, watching 73 German women through the grey mist. He was 42 years old, 18 years in the United States Army, and he held a requisition form in his right hand that could end his career. The form, typed on standard War Department letterhead, read in precise military language: request for fabric, thread, personal items, Christmas gifts, enemy personnel. His commanding officer's words from yesterday still echoed: "Sergeant, you can't give this to the enemy." The women moved through the fog like ghosts. Some headed toward the mess hall. Others walked to the laundry facility where they worked for 80 cents per day. McKenzie had memorized their routine over the past 6 weeks. Wake at 0600. Roll call at 0615. Breakfast at 0630. Work assignments beginning at 0700. Every day identical. Every movement supervised by 6 female guards borrowed from the Women's Army Corps, the only women the Army could spare for this unprecedented assignment. The German women had arrived at Camp Como on November 1st, 1944, via train from the New York Processing Center. 73 women, ages ranging from 19 to 47, captured between Tunisia in 1943 and Italy in the autumn of 1944. McKenzie had reviewed their manifest repeatedly. Nurses, radio operators, administrative clerks, truck drivers. Women who had served the German military in auxiliary roles, never carrying weapons, never in direct combat, but still considered prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Their arrival had created immediate problems. The United States Army had been managing prisoner of war camps since 1942. By late 1944, approximately 400,000 German and Italian prisoners were held in camps across America. The system worked efficiently for male prisoners. Standardized barracks, established protocols, clear regulations. But female prisoners were different. The Army had barely planned for their existence. Camp Como had been built for male German prisoners. When the 73 women arrived, the camp administration had to improvise everything. They cleared a separate compound, installed additional fencing, requisitioned different barracks. The Geneva Convention required the same basic treatment as male prisoners: medical care, adequate food, work opportunities, canteen access. But the practical complications were enormous. Where male prisoners needed razor blades and cigarettes from the canteen, female prisoners needed different items entirely. The camp's supply chain had no protocols for this. McKenzie had been born in 1902, the son of an Iowa farmer who worked 160 acres of corn and soybeans outside Cedar Rapids. He had enlisted in the Army in 1926 during peacetime, when the military offered steady pay and 3 meals daily, luxuries during agricultural depression. He had married in 1928, a woman named Margaret from Davenport, and they had 2 daughters, Sarah, born in 1928, and Helen in 1930. Margaret died in 1938 from influenza. The girls lived with Margaret's sister in Des Moines. McKenzie sent them $50 monthly and wrote letters every Sunday evening. 7 years of Sundays, 364 letters describing his Army career while watching his daughters grow up through their replies. His specialty was logistics and supply chain management. The Army called him the sergeant who makes things work. He had managed 3 prisoner of war camps since 1943, moving from facility to facility as the War Department identified problems requiring his particular skills. Camp Como was his 3rd assignment. He had arrived in September 1944 to improve efficiency in the supply system. Then the women arrived in November, and efficiency became the least of his concerns. The first week revealed the real problem. The German women had nothing. They had been captured wearing military uniforms, processed through Allied intelligence, transported across the Atlantic, moved through American processing centers, and arrived at Camp Como with exactly what they wore. No personal items, no hygiene products beyond what the Army issued to any prisoner, industrial soap and basic medical supplies, nothing else. The army provided them with standard prisoner-of-war uniforms, but these were sized for men. The uniforms hung loosely or pulled tight in wrong places. The women tried to alter them with no thread or needles. By the second week, the camp doctor, Captain Harold Jensen, began reporting problems. The women were improvising solutions for basic needs. They tore strips from their ill-fitting uniforms to create sanitary materials. They attempted to repair clothing using fibers pulled from vegetation. One woman tried to make gentler soap from kitchen grease and gave herself a chemical burn requiring medical treatment. Jensen documented everything in official reports: infection risks, skin conditions, health concerns that would worsen without proper materials. McKenzie interviewed the women through Corporal Anna Schmidt, a German-American interpreter from Wisconsin. He created detailed lists of what they actually needed. Not luxuries, necessities. Thread, needles, fabric, soap that wouldn't burn skin, items for basic hygiene and health. The Geneva Convention stated that prisoners of war could purchase reasonable items from camp canteens using wages earned from work assignments. The women at Camp Como earned 80 cents daily doing laundry. By late November, the average woman had accumulated between $18 and $22 in canteen funds. But the Camp Como canteen was stocked for male prisoners. Cigarettes at 5 cents per pack, candy bars, razor blades, playing cards, nothing appropriate for women's actual needs. They had money, but nothing to buy. McKenzie spent the first 2 weeks of November interviewing the German women systematically, one conversation at a time, building documentation that would support whatever action he eventually took. Corporal Schmidt translated, while McKenzie took notes in a standard Army field notebook, black composition book with lined pages, filling 47 pages with handwritten observations between November 8th and November 22nd. He organized his findings by category: clothing repair needs, hygiene requirements, medical concerns, morale factors. Each category received its own section with specific examples and supporting evidence. The documentation revealed dangerous improvisations. Women were using torn uniform cloth for sanitary needs, creating infection risks that Captain Jensen documented in 3 separate medical reports, dated November 12th, November 16th, and November 20th. One woman named Margaret Bauer, age 26, former Wehrmacht administrative clerk captured near Salerno, had been hospitalized on November 18th with a bacterial infection directly traced to improvised sanitary materials. Jensen's report stated the infection required antibiotic treatment and 5 days of bed rest. Another woman, Johanna Krebs, age 31, a nurse captured at Monte Cassino, had attempted to repair her uniform using grass fibers twisted into makeshift thread. The grass caused skin irritation, documented with photographs Jensen took for medical records. The most serious incident occurred on November 14th when Elizabeth Hartmann, age 23, a radio operator from Hamburg, tried to make gentler soap from kitchen grease and lye. She suffered second-degree chemical burns on both hands, requiring treatment and bandaging for 9 days. McKenzie photographed the current conditions within regulations, careful never to capture faces or identifying features, only the physical environment and material conditions. He documented the ill-fitting uniforms, the improvised repairs, the industrial soap that left women's hands cracked and bleeding. Every photograph received a typed caption with date, time, and factual description. No editorializing, no emotional language, just observable reality presented as evidence. The women's work earnings accumulated steadily. Camp records showed they performed laundry services for the entire facility, washing uniforms and linens for 840 male German prisoners and 127 American personnel. The work was hard, 10 hours daily in the steam-filled laundry building, hands in hot water, lifting wet fabric that weighed considerably more than dry. But the women worked without complaint because the 80 cents daily added up. By November 22nd, the lowest earner had accumulated $17.60 in canteen funds. The highest earner, a woman who worked extra shifts, had $23.20. But when McKenzie examined the canteen inventory, he found nothing they could appropriately purchase. The canteen stocked 47 different items, every single one designed for male prisoners. On November 20th, McKenzie received a letter from his daughters, standard weekly correspondence that arrived every Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on mail routing from Iowa. Sarah, now 16, and Helen, 14, wrote alternating weeks. This letter came from Helen. She described their school activities, their aunt's health, their preparations for Christmas. Then she mentioned a church project. The First Baptist Church of Des Moines was organizing a donation drive for European war orphans, collecting fabric scraps so children could have new clothes. Helen had contributed 2 old dresses she had outgrown. The church women would cut the fabric into usable pieces and ship them to refugee organizations in England for distribution to displaced children across Europe. McKenzie read the letter twice while sitting at his desk in the non-commissioned officers' quarters, a small room with a cot, a desk, a footlocker, and one window overlooking the main camp yard. He looked out that window toward the female compound 200 yards away, separated by 2 fences and a guardhouse. He watched the German women crossing from their barracks to the laundry building for the afternoon shift, wearing their ill-fitting uniforms, carrying nothing because they owned nothing to carry. Then he looked back at Helen's letter describing fabric donations for enemy children in Europe, while enemy women at Camp Como had no fabric at all. The calendar on his desk showed November 20th, 1944. McKenzie counted forward. 35 days until December 25th. These women would spend Christmas as prisoners of war, which was appropriate under the circumstances of international armed conflict. But they would spend it with literally nothing beyond what hung on their bodies, which seemed like something different than appropriate detention, something closer to deliberate deprivation. McKenzie pulled his copy of the Geneva Convention from his footlocker, the 1929 Convention, relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, 97 articles printed in English translation. He had read it multiple times since taking his first POW camp assignment in 1943. Now he read it again, looking for specific language. Article 12 stated that prisoners of war must receive adequate food, clothing, and medical attention. Article 17 permitted prisoners to purchase supplementary items from canteens established in camps. Article 36 required captive POWs to provide facilities enabling prisoners to maintain their health and hygiene according to reasonable standards. McKenzie spent the next 3 days drafting a requisition. He worked on it during evening hours after completing his regular duties, writing and rewriting until the language satisfied his standards for precision and justification. The final version covered 2 type pages on standard War Department requisition forms. He itemized every request with exact quantities and official justifications written in proper military administrative language. 150 yards of cotton fabric in various colors, designated purpose clothing repair and personal items construction. 73 complete sewing kits containing needles, thread, small scissors, and thimbles, designated purpose maintenance of existing garments and hygiene-related sewing needs. 292 spools of thread in assorted colors, calculated as 4 spools per prisoner for extended use requirements. 73 bars of ivory soap, designated purpose hygiene standards, compliance and prevention of dermatological conditions. 146 yards of muslin fabric, designated purpose undergarment construction per female sanitary requirements. 73 small mirrors measuring approximately 4 inches by 6 inches, designated purpose grooming standards, maintenance. The total estimated cost was $187.50. McKenzie attached Captain Jensen's 3 medical reports documenting health problems caused by inadequate materials. He cited specific Geneva Convention articles, numbers 12, 17, and 36. He included a cost-benefit analysis showing that providing proper materials would reduce medical treatment expenses by preventing infections and injuries. He noted that the women possessed sufficient canteen funds to purchase these items if the camp would stock them, making this a revenue-neutral transaction for the Army. On November 25th at 0900 hours, Mackenzie submitted the requisition to Camp Commander Colonel William Bradford. Colonel William Bradford returned the requisition within 2 hours. Mackenzie was working in the supply warehouse when a runner delivered the papers back to him at 1100 hours on November 25th. Across the top of the first page, Bradford had stamped in red ink, "Denied." Below the stamp, Bradford had written in his own handwriting, "Sergeant, we don't provide comfort items to the enemy. These women are prisoners, not guests." Discussion closed. That night, Mackenzie sat in his quarters and wrote in his personal diary, a habit he had maintained since 1926 when he first enlisted. The entry for November 25th, 1944 stated, "Colonel doesn't understand. This isn't comfort. This is necessity. He doesn't see the difference because he doesn't have to look at these women every day and watch them trying to hold themselves together with nothing." Mackenzie decided the next morning to build a stronger case. If Colonel Bradford wouldn't listen to one request, supported by medical reports and Geneva Convention citations, then Mackenzie would gather evidence so overwhelming that someone higher in the chain of command would have to listen. He began a systematic documentation project that consumed every evening hour for the next 2 weeks. He photographed conditions in the female compound daily, always within regulations, always focused on material conditions rather than individual prisoners. He compiled every medical report Captain Jensen had written since the women arrived. He recorded testimony from the 6 female WAC guards about the daily challenges they observed. The guards reported that the German women were becoming increasingly desperate. One guard, Corporal Linda Morrison from Tennessee, told Mackenzie that she had seen 2 women fighting over a single sewing needle on November 22nd. The needle had been smuggled into camp somehow, probably traded from a guard, and when one woman tried to borrow it, the owner refused, terrified she would never get it back. The fight had escalated until guards separated them. On November 28th, Mackenzie discovered something that changed his approach entirely. While researching Army regulations in the camp library, a small room containing military manuals and administrative references, he found mention of another camp holding German female prisoners. Camp Clinton, Mississippi, located 180 miles south of Camp Como, had been holding 42 German women since June 1944. Mackenzie immediately wrote to the supply sergeant at Camp Clinton, explaining his situation and asking what solutions they had found. The response arrived on December 2nd. The Camp Clinton supply sergeant, a man named Walter Hughes, had enclosed a copy of their approved requisition list. Camp Clinton had been providing fabric, sewing supplies, soap, mirrors, and personal items to their German female prisoners since August 1944. The requisition had been approved through a different command structure, bypassing camp-level authority and going directly to theatre command in Washington. Hughes explained in his letter that Camp Clinton's commander had initially refused their request, exactly like Bradford, but the camp doctor had elevated the issue on medical grounds, and theatre command had approved it within 3 weeks. Mackenzie now had precedent. Another camp facing identical circumstances had secured approval for identical items through proper channels. On December 3rd, he prepared a second submission, this time with significantly more supporting documentation. He included Captain Jensen's medical necessity reports, now numbering 5 separate documents dated between November 12th and December 1st. He attached the Camp Clinton precedent, showing their approved requisition and the theatre command authorization letter. He added a detailed cost-benefit analysis demonstrating that preventing infections and injuries through proper materials would cost the Army approximately $187.50, while treating the medical problems caused by inadequate materials had already cost $340 in medical supplies, hospital bed days, and staff time for just 3 cases in November. Mackenzie strengthened his Geneva Convention argument by citing specific language from Articles 12, 17, and 36, then adding quotes from the International Red Cross guidelines for female prisoner facilities. He included personal testimony from Corporal Schmidt, the interpreter, about morale concerns and increasing tensions among the women. Schmidt had documented in her daily reports that the women were becoming hostile toward each other, fighting over tiny resources, hoarding scraps of fabric or broken pieces of mirror. The competition for nothing was creating dangerous conditions. McKenzie added incident reports to support his case. November 18th, one prisoner hospitalized for infection directly caused by improvised sanitary materials. Treatment cost $67, 5 days of bed rest reducing available workforce. November 22nd, prisoner treated for severe skin reactions from harsh industrial soap and grass fiber irritants. Treatment cost $23, 9 days of restricted duty. November 29th, physical altercation between prisoners over possession of single needle. Both women placed in disciplinary confinement for 48 hours, reducing workforce and creating additional guard requirements. His cover memorandum stated plainly, "This is not generosity toward enemies. This is adherence to international law and basic sanitation requirements. Providing these items serves United States military interests by maintaining prisoner health, reducing medical costs, and ensuring compliance with Geneva Convention obligations that protect American prisoners held by enemy forces." McKenzie submitted the revised requisition on December 4th at 0800 hours. Colonel Bradford summoned him to headquarters at 1400 hours that same afternoon. Bradford's office occupied the corner of the headquarters building, a room with windows overlooking both the main camp yard and the female compound in the distance. McKenzie stood at attention while Bradford sat behind his desk, the revised requisition spread across the surface between them. Bradford was 53 years old, West Point class of 1914, a career officer who had served in France during the previous war and had commanded prisoner of war facilities since 1942. He looked at McKenzie for a long moment before speaking. Bradford explained his perspective carefully, his voice calm but firm. These women had served the Nazi military apparatus. They had supported operations that killed American soldiers. Meanwhile, American families at home were enduring rationing, sacrificing butter and sugar and meat so the military could feed soldiers fighting overseas. How would it look if newspapers discovered that the army was providing comfort items to German prisoners while American mothers made do with less? Bradford had received letters from civilians asking why prisoners seemed to receive better treatment than law-abiding citizens. The political implications were serious. Bradford told McKenzie about his own father, a veteran of the First World War who had fought against Germans in the Argonne Forest in 1918. His father had come home saying that Germans didn't deserve mercy, didn't deserve kindness, deserved only what absolute military necessity required and nothing more. Bradford had grown up hearing those stories. He understood that war required hard decisions and harder hearts. McKenzie responded quietly that he wasn't asking to give the women Christmas presents. He was asking to let them purchase basic supplies with money they had earned through their own labor. The army was already paying them for work performed. The canteen was already required to provide reasonable items for purchase. He was simply requesting that reasonable be defined appropriately for the prisoners actually held at Camp Como. This wasn't generosity. This was basic administrative competence. Bradford stood up from his desk and walked to the window. He looked out toward the female compound for perhaps 30 seconds without speaking. Then he turned back to McKenzie and said the request was denied. That decision was final. McKenzie was dismissed. McKenzie returned to his quarters and sat on his cot staring at the wall. The requisition had been denied twice through official channels. He had documented medical necessity, cited precedent, provided cost analysis, and quoted international law. None of it had mattered. The system had spoken, and the system said no. But McKenzie couldn't stop thinking about the women in that compound. On December 5th, he walked into Como town, 3 miles from the camp, and found the First Methodist Church on Main Street. He asked to speak with the pastor, a man named James Wilson, 61 years old, who had led that congregation for 23 years. McKenzie explained the situation carefully, making clear he was not acting in official capacity, not requesting military supplies, but asking if the church community might consider helping. Pastor Wilson listened without interrupting. When Mackenzie finished, Wilson said his congregation had been supporting the war effort through various programs, collecting scrap metal, organizing bond drives, sending care packages to local men serving overseas. He had never considered helping enemy prisoners, but Wilson said he would bring the matter to the Women's Auxiliary Group and see what they thought. 3 days later, on December 8th, Pastor Wilson drove to Camp Como in his personal vehicle, a 1937 Ford, and delivered 4 boxes to Mackenzie. Inside were fabric scraps donated by women from 3 different churches across 2 counties, spools of thread that church members had contributed from their sewing baskets, bars of soap purchased with church funds, and several small mirrors collected from households. The total wasn't enough for all 73 women, but it was something. Mackenzie facilitated delivery through proper procedures, logging everything as civilian charitable donation, permitted under camp regulations that allowed prisoners to receive care packages from recognized humanitarian organizations. He distributed the items to the women on December 9th, watching their reactions through the fence. Several women cried. One woman held a piece of blue fabric against her face as if it were the most valuable thing she had ever touched. On December 10th, someone reported Mackenzie to higher command. He never learned who filed the complaint, whether it was a guard who disagreed with his actions or another soldier who believed he was being too soft on prisoners, or perhaps even Colonel Bradford himself covering his own position. The report alleged unauthorized fraternization with enemy personnel and misuse of military resources to provide comfort to prisoners beyond Geneva Convention requirements. The telegram from Theatre Command arrived on December 11th. Inspector General Colonel Raymond Porter would arrive on December 13th to investigate allegations against Master Sergeant Robert McKenzie. The message specified that Porter would conduct a full inspection of Camp Como's female prisoner operations and interview all relevant personnel. Mackenzie was ordered to make himself and all documentation available for review. Bradford summoned Mackenzie that afternoon and told him he had created an incident. Mackenzie replied that he had solved a problem. Bradford said he had solved it by going around military authority, by ignoring orders, by involving civilians in military operations. Mackenzie said he had solved it by going to the community the army was supposed to be protecting and asking them to live up to their own values. Bradford told Mackenzie to prepare every document, every photograph, every piece of correspondence for inspection. Porter had a reputation as strict but fair, which meant he followed regulations precisely. If Mackenzie had violated proper procedure, Porter would recommend disciplinary action regardless of intentions. Court-martial was possible. Dishonorable discharge was possible. 20 years of service could end in disgrace over fabric and thread. Mackenzie spent December 11th and 12th organizing his documentation into clear categories, everything arranged chronologically, every piece of evidence labeled and cross-referenced. He prepared his testimony, writing out exactly what he had done and why he had done it. He didn't try to hide anything or minimize his actions. He had circumvented his commanding officer's direct orders by seeking civilian assistance. That was insubordination by any military definition. But he had also prevented medical emergencies and maintained Geneva Convention compliance. Whether that justified his methods would be Porter's decision. Colonel Porter arrived at 0800 hours on December 13th with a single aide, a young lieutenant who carried a briefcase and took notes. Porter was 48 years old, a career logistics officer who had spent the war managing supply chains across 3 theaters. His reputation said he cared about results more than protocol, but only when protocol genuinely interfered with mission accomplishment. When protocol existed for good reasons, Porter enforced it absolutely. The inspection lasted 9 hours. Porter began at the female compound, spending 2 full hours examining conditions that Mackenzie had documented in his photographs. He walked through the barracks, inspected the laundry facilities, observed the canteen that stocked nothing appropriate for the women who were supposed to use it. He examined the civilian-donated items that some women had already begun using, fabric pieces sewn into crude undergarments, thread being carefully rationed among small groups, soap being shared because there wasn't enough for everyone. Porter interviewed Captain Jensen first, reviewing medical records in the camp hospital for 90 minutes. Jensen showed him treatment logs for the 3 serious cases in November, explained the ongoing concerns about infections and skin conditions, described the improvised solutions women were attempting with dangerous materials. Jensen stated directly that the current situation violated basic medical standards and created preventable health risks that would worsen as winter progressed and sanitation became more difficult. Corporal Schmidt was interviewed next, providing translation services, while also describing her observations from 6 weeks of daily interaction with the prisoners. Schmidt told Porter that the women's morale had been deteriorating steadily, that competition for minimal resources was creating hostility and distrust, that the arrival of civilian donations had produced visible improvement in cooperation and attitude. She described watching women who had been hoarding broken mirror pieces, suddenly willing to share when they received whole mirrors, watching women who had been fighting over needles form sewing circles when adequate supplies became available. Porter interviewed 3 of the German prisoners through Schmidt's translation. The first was Gertrude Hoffmann, 34 years old, a nurse who had been captured at Monte Cassino in May 1944 after spending 9 months treating German casualties in field hospitals behind the Italian front lines. Hoffmann told Porter through Schmidt that she had expected harsh treatment as a prisoner, expected minimal food and difficult conditions, expected to be treated as an enemy combatant, even though she had never carried a weapon. Instead, she said, Sergeant McKenzie had treated them as human beings who happened to be enemies, and she believed there was an important difference between those 2 approaches. She said McKenzie had shown them that Americans could maintain their values even toward people they were fighting, which had forced her to reconsider what she had been told about American weakness and moral corruption. The second prisoner was Helene Fischer, 28 years old, a radio operator from Munich who had been captured in Tunisia in May 1943 and had spent 18 months in various prisoner facilities before arriving at Camp Como. Fischer told Porter that she had been held at 3 different camps, 2 in North Africa and 1 in New York, and none of them had addressed the basic reality that women needed different items than men. She said McKenzie was the first person in 18 months who had actually looked at their situation and tried to solve the real problems, rather than simply applying male prisoner protocols to female prisoners and hoping it would work. Porter spent 90 minutes questioning McKenzie in Bradford's office with Bradford present. He asked McKenzie to explain every decision chronologically, starting with the women's arrival on November 1st. McKenzie walked through his documentation methodically, showing the photographs, the medical reports, the incident logs, the cost analysis, the Camp Clinton precedent, the Geneva Convention citations. Porter asked why McKenzie had sought civilian assistance after his commanding officer denied the requisition. McKenzie stated that he had exhausted military channels and believed he had a duty to solve a problem that was creating health risks and potential Geneva Convention violations. Porter asked directly whether McKenzie had acted to undermine military authority. McKenzie said, "No, sir. He had acted because it was the right thing to do, and because nobody else was doing it." Porter asked to see the civilian donation records. McKenzie provided Pastor Wilson's documentation showing exactly what had been donated, by whom, and when. Porter asked if McKenzie had promised anything to the civilians in exchange for donations. McKenzie said no. He had simply explained the situation and asked if they wanted to help. Porter asked if McKenzie understood that he had circumvented his commanding officer's direct order. McKenzie said yes, sir. He understood that completely, and he would do it again under the same circumstances, because letting women suffer preventable medical problems to avoid political complications was not consistent with his understanding of military duty. Porter concluded his inspection at 1700 hours on December 13th. He told Bradford and McKenzie that he needed to review all documentation thoroughly and that his decision would come through theatre command within days. He provided no indication of his conclusions. He departed Camp Como on December 14th, leaving McKenzie to continue his regular duties while waiting for judgment. December 14th through 17th passed slowly. McKenzie worked his normal supply warehouse shifts, conducted his regular inspections, filed his routine reports. The German women continued using the civilian-donated materials. Guards reported no incidents. Medical reports showed the infection rate was already declining. The sewing circles that had formed were producing results. Women teaching each other techniques, sharing knowledge about how to make clothing last longer, how to repair tears more effectively, how to construct items from minimal materials. On December 17th evening, Mackenzie wrote to his daughters. He described his duties in general terms, mentioned that he was working with a challenging situation, avoided any details that censorship would remove. He wrote, "I may have made a mistake trying to do the right thing, but your mother always told me that doing right sometimes means accepting consequences." He asked about their Christmas plans. He signed the letter. "Remember, treating people with dignity costs nothing, and it's worth everything." He sealed the envelope and placed it in outgoing mail, uncertain whether he would still be wearing his uniform when they received it. December 18th, at 0830 hours, Bradford summoned Mackenzie to headquarters. The telegraph from Theatre Command sat on Bradford's desk. Bradford read the telegraph aloud in official military voice. Inspector General Porter's recommendation stated that Sergeant Mackenzie's actions were consistent with Geneva Convention requirements and United States Army values. Camp Como was authorized to establish proper canteen supplies for female prisoner of war personnel immediately. The requisition was approved retroactively with funds allocated from Theatre Command Emergency Operations budget. Then Bradford read a second section, handwritten notes that Porter had added to the official telegram. Porter wrote that Sergeant Mackenzie had identified a systematic failure in prisoner of war camp protocols for female prisoners, that his initiative had prevented a potential international incident, and that he recommended commendation for problem solving under unusual circumstances. Bradford set the telegraph down and looked at Mackenzie for a long moment. He said that Mackenzie had been right, and that he, Bradford, had been thinking about politics and public perception, while Mackenzie had been thinking about people and practical problems. Bradford told Mackenzie not to make him look like a fool again. Mackenzie replied that Bradford looked like a commander who had listened to his non-commissioned officer, and that wasn't foolish. That was good leadership. Theatre Command processed the emergency requisition with unusual speed, pushing it through normal channels in 4 days instead of the typical 3 weeks. The supplies arrived at Camp Como on December 22nd via military transport truck. The shipment included 200 yards of fabric in various colors and patterns, 100 complete sewing kits containing needles in multiple sizes, plus thread and small scissors and brass thimbles, 400 spools of thread in assorted colors, 100 bars of soap including both Ivory and Lux brands, 200 yards of muslin fabric for undergarment construction, 100 small mirrors, and additional items that Theatre Command had added, including combs and basic cosmetics and writing paper. The total cost was $243.75, funded entirely by military appropriations. Mackenzie supervised the distribution on December 22nd at 1400 hours. Each woman received an allocation based on the protocols Camp Clinton had established, with additional items available for purchase using canteen funds. The guards who witnessed the distribution reported in their daily logs that several women cried while receiving the supplies. One woman named Helene Fisher held a small mirror and stared at her own reflection for nearly 5 minutes, as if seeing herself clearly for the first time in months. Another woman, Maria Schultz, a 41-year-old former truck driver from Bremen, told Corporal Schmidt that she had been treated as a criminal by her own army, shipped to North Africa with inadequate supplies, and told to make sacrifices for the Reich, but that Americans had treated her as a person with basic needs that deserved to be met. The women spent the next 48 hours sewing. Every available hour outside of work assignments and meals was devoted to creating items they desperately needed. Each woman produced at least one new piece of clothing. Several women who had been seamstresses before the war taught others advanced techniques for efficient cutting and strong seams. One woman created a simple dress from 3 yards of blue cotton fabric, working through the night of December 23rd to finish it by Christmas Eve. Another group collaborated on Christmas decorations, cutting fabric scraps into shapes and sewing them into garlands that they hung in their barracks. Christmas Eve arrived with cold rain, temperature dropping to 34 degrees, unusual for Mississippi, but not unprecedented. The German women requested permission to hold a Christmas Eve gathering in the main barracks common room. Bradford approved with guard supervision. That evening, 73 women gathered wearing clothes they had made or repaired with their own hands over the previous 2 days. They sang Christmas carols in German, their voices carrying across the compound through the cold December air. Guards standing watch outside reported hearing Stille Nacht, the German version of Silent Night, sung in 4-part harmony by women who had been enemies 6 weeks ago and were still enemies now, but were also human beings, marking a holiday that transcended the war. Mackenzie stood outside the fence listening. He thought about his daughters in Iowa, probably attending Christmas Eve service at their church, probably singing the same hymn in English. He thought about Margaret, dead 6 years, who had always believed that kindness was strength rather than weakness. He thought about the 73 women inside that fence who had spent 2 years as prisoners and would spend more time as prisoners before this war ended, but who tonight had clean clothes and adequate supplies and a small measure of dignity restored. Christmas morning, December 25th at 0900 hours, Corporal Schmidt brought a package to Mackenzie's quarters. She explained it came from the German women prisoners. Inside was a handkerchief, white cotton, hand sewn with careful stitches. Embroidered across one corner in blue thread were the words Danke, Christmas 1944, Camp Como. Around all 4 borders were 73 sets of initials, each woman's signature sewn in her own hand. Schmidt told Mackenzie the women had worked on it together, passing it from person to person, each adding her initials as a way of saying they understood what he had done and why it mattered. Mackenzie kept that handkerchief for the rest of his life. When he died in 1992 at age 90, his children donated it to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where it remains in the collection today. The display placard quotes an interview Mackenzie gave in 1987. That handkerchief meant more than any medal I ever received. It meant I had stayed human during a war that tried very hard to make everyone forget how. In January 1945, Theatre Command issued Directive 45G, establishing standards for female enemy prisoner facilities across all camps in United States territory and overseas operations. The directive specifically addressed appropriate clothing and personal items, canteen supplies adapted to actual prisoner populations, sanitation and hygiene requirements, and medical care protocols. The directive credited field observations and recommendations from Camp Como staff, never mentioning Mackenzie by name, but implementing every change he had fought to make happen. The 73 women remained at Camp Como until mid-1946, when repatriation finally began. They returned to Germany in September 1946, some to British occupation zones, others to American zones, going back to a destroyed country and an uncertain future. 3 women wrote letters to Mackenzie in 1947 and 1948, correspondence forwarded through International Red Cross channels. Gertrude Hoffmann wrote that she had become a midwife in Hamburg and that Mackenzie had taught her that enemies could still be human, a lesson that had saved her faith in humanity after everything she had witnessed. Helene Fisher wrote that she was working as a translator for American occupation forces, that Mackenzie's example had shown her that the best of American values were worth preserving even in defeated Germany. Mackenzie remained in the army until 1948, promoted to Master Sergeant First Class and assigned to the War Department in Washington, where he helped develop post-war prisoner repatriation protocols. He was discharged in October 1948 at age 46, returned to Iowa, and worked as County Veteran Services Coordinator until 1968. He married Anna Schmidt, the Camp Como interpreter, in 1951. They had one son born in 1952. Mackenzie rarely discussed the war except for one story he told repeatedly, the story of 73 German women and a handkerchief sewn with gratitude. The handkerchief sits in a museum display case today. Most visitors walk past without stopping. Those who pause read that a sergeant gave enemy prisoners a Christmas gift in 1944, but the real story is deeper. The story is that maintaining humanity during war requires daily choice, choosing dignity over dehumanization, choosing to see enemies and still see people, choosing compassion even when regulations and politics and anger say otherwise. McKenzie made that choice. It cost him $243.75 in military supplies and nearly cost him his career. The return was 73 women treated as human beings, a policy change that affected thousands of prisoners, and proof that treating enemies with basic dignity isn't weakness, but the hardest kind of strength.